Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 12 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Philadelphia Flyers, in which the Sharks have won 2-1. It is an absolute cause for a celebration here tonight. The Sharks finally get their first win of the season, something that many thought might not actually end up happening at any point after they started the season with 11 straight losses, tying a record for most losses to begin a season in NHL history. And they came oh so close to getting that record, making themselves historically the worst team to start a year, but it does not happen. And while this game ends up being extremely close, the Sharks do win it, and even in regulation at that. So certainly rather impressive for the San Jose Sharks. And this one starts off significantly better in the first period than the two previous games. Now, I should mention, of course, like I did in the previous review, the Pittsburgh Penguins, that first period, it really wasn't all that bad for San Jose, but they found themselves in a 2-goal deficit, so on the scoreboard, things were not great. And then, of course, in the previous game against Vancouver, they found themselves 4 goals down in the first period, which is just generally awful. And so here tonight, not only do they not find themselves in a deficit at the end, but they actually find themselves with the lead in those first 20 minutes, something that has been very, very scarce thus far this year for the San Jose Sharks. It is Duclair who makes it 1-0 for San Jose, and that is the score at the end of the first period. And in the second period, talking about scarce, the Sharks actually get up there with a 2-goal lead in this game thanks to a William Eklund power play goal. Unfortunately for the Sharks, it would be a Joel Farabee goal that would manage to bring this back to within 1, and this was a very dangerous goal, primarily because this comes at the end of the second period. Now, usually these late period goals are already going to be tough because it kind of sets a bad mood going into the locker room for the intermission, but specifically for a San Jose Sharks team that is likely extremely fragile mentally after losing 11 straight games and 2 straight games in which they gave up 10 plus goals, you might be heading into that intermission with the thoughts of, oh my God, we're going to lose yet another game because we just gave that one up. But credit for the Sharks not falling apart, and going into the third period, they don't give up any other goals in this game. They might not score any others either, but the 2 goals that they score here tonight is enough to get them that first win of the season. And I do also want to circle back on something that I talked about in my previous review of the Pittsburgh Penguins game, which has to do with the coaching staff. Now, I expected something to happen here with David Quinn, primarily that he would end up getting fired over the coming days prior to this game here tonight. It didn't end up happening, but there was obviously a message sent from the front office, specifically that Mike Grier had a meeting with the Sharks player and sort of told them off, I guess you could say, saying that you need to be part of the solution here, this is unacceptable, all of these types of things. But it seemingly was a bit of a double down on Mike Grier's faith in David Quinn to be able to lead this team out of the darkness that was these first 11 games of the season. Because if you were ever going to have a good reason to fire David Quinn, it would have been over these last couple of days, and the fact that they have not done so likely means that he's locked in for much of the rest of this regular season. I'm not going to say that it's completely out of the question that he ever gets fired, but this was the moment, and the fact that it doesn't happen is quite the testament of sort of quite the statement from Mike Grier in regards to his coaching staff. Anyhow, moving on to the players to talk about here tonight for the San Jose Sharks. Finally, we get to mention how these players actually performed, because in the 2 previous games, there really wasn't much of a reason to. When you lose by such a wide margin, it's hard to really point out any positives from any of the players. But here tonight, the fact that the Sharks actually managed to get a win means some of these players must have had some pretty good games. And we start off immediately with the top line. Eklund is joining Tomas Hertl on this top line. Now, frequently he has been placed with centerman Mikael Granlund. David Quinn seemed to really want to build that chemistry between those two players, but for the lack of a better option here with those past couple of losses of giving up 20 goals combined in those two games. Finally, Eklund is indeed placed with Hertl, and it works out rather well, not only for William Eklund, who had a solid game, I'll get to that a bit later, but primarily for it seemingly was Tomas Hertl, who absolutely, I felt, had his best game of the season. I've been extremely critical of Tomas Hertl thus far this year. I felt as though he really hasn't been living up to his potential and to the contract that he had somewhat recently signed over these past couple of years with the San Jose Sharks. But here tonight, he looked a bit like the Hertl of old, dominating when he was on the ice, making the Philadelphia Flyers defensemen look absolutely silly in their own zone as he just manages to create a ton of space for his two line mates and for himself as well, just really forcing the issue time and time again when he was on the ice. And while it didn't, end up with a ton of points for himself or anything like that, it is a fantastic step towards Hertl actually playing well on a consistent basis. Will we indeed end up seeing that? I'm not entirely sure, but like I said, definitely his best performance of the year thus far. When it comes to his line mate Eklund, I thought he also played a solid game. Wasn't anything amazing and not quite at the level of Tomas Hertl, but I thought he was a very strong compliment to him. Obviously, he ends up scoring that power play goal, which was nice to see. Eklund has been one of the very, very few bright spots for the San Jose Sharks thus far this season, and likely could have had multiple more points if some of his line mates were able to finish a bit more. He had some slightly more skilled teammates on the ice with him, so his point totals are still relatively low, but here it's nice to see him get rewarded with that goal. It's good to see that. But when it comes to the final line mate on this line, Fabian Zetterlund, I thought he wasn't all that great. Zetterlund definitely felt as though he was a bit of the weak link on this line, kind of riding the coattails of both Hertl and Eklund, where his statistics will look pretty good just because he happened to be on the ice with these two players, but it never felt as though Zetterlund was the one making the plays, and in fact, it felt as though a lot of the time to play would die on Zetterlund's stick. And I've mentioned multiple times in the past that Zetterlund, while he was very good when he was playing in that middle six at the beginning of the season for the San Jose Sharks, David Quinn kind of bumped him up to this top line, and it hasn't actually worked out super well for Zetterlund, and yet he's continuing to keep that spot there, which is just a big question mark for me because I don't really think he should be, and you would rather actually have a good Zetterlund playing in the middle six than a pretty bad Zetterlund on your top line. Then we move on to the second line as we saw Duclair get bumped down after multiple games in a row with Tomas Hertl on the top line. He gets dropped to the second line, and it seems to work wonders for Duclair. Now, to be fair, in the previous game against the Pittsburgh Penguins, really the only forward who was even doing anything of value for the San Jose Sharks was Duclair. So this isn't necessarily a completely out of nowhere scenario where he plays well here tonight. It did start in the previous game, but this was a very good game for Duclair. He was all over the ice. Probably could have had, he had one goal, probably could have had two, perhaps even three goals in this one. Got stonewalled on a breakaway late in the third period, had another great chance. I believe it was in the early parts of the third or perhaps in the second period. So just generally Duclair using his skill, using his speed very, very well. It wasn't in the same level of dominance as Tomas Hertl. It's not as though Duclair is like a Timo Meier where he comes on the ice and you're just like, wow, he's extremely noticeable, but he's able to make use of his speed very well to sort of put himself in great positions to get those great chances, to get these rush opportunities, and we saw that on full display here tonight for sure. When it comes to his other two line mates, Granlund, I thought was hit or miss at times. There were a few shifts where I was really impressed with Granlund, a few other shifts where I thought he was not particularly great, but I guess generally it was a positive game for Granlund for sure, and the same type of idea would go for Kevin Labanc as well. There were some issues defensively, sometimes where it felt as though he was slightly checked out. Labanc is always the type of player who, for whatever reason, when he gets these longer shifts, he seems to be someone laboring a lot more than any other player on the ice. I don't know if that's like a conditioning issue or what, but that does seem to happen with Labanc a lot throughout his game. But I thought on the offensive side of things, he was doing a lot of good positives. He was having some good chemistry, some nice passes with Duclair, including the pass that led to Duclair's actual goal in this game. So it was an effective second line, I would say. When it comes to the third line, however, not really so much effective. It continues to be Zadina paired with Hoffman, a duo that we have seen previously thus far this season. And both of these players, ever since the first couple of games where they both looked pretty decent, have really just kind of fallen off a cliff and haven't really done anything for the last 6 or 7 games at this point this season. And so putting them both together makes it so that this line just does absolutely nothing throughout this game. They're just not really a positive at all. And when I don't think they're necessarily an overwhelming negative for the San Jose Sharks, the fact that the third line here in a year where the Sharks, they're facing a couple of injuries, but they should have slightly better forward depth than last season, it's definitely disappointing to see that this line is just an absolute wash and completely powerless to provide any sort of offense for the San Jose Sharks. And then when it comes to the fourth line, the Sharks seem to have sort of loaded up physically on the fourth line with Givani Smith joining Luke Kunin here in this situation. So Kunin at times previous in this season was playing up in the lineup. As we all know, he was on that second line with Eklund and Granlund rather frequently, and while he was getting chances, he wasn't actually converting on those chances. And so finally he gets bumped down to the fourth line, somewhere where his skill set is better suited, I would say. And this fourth line, they weren't really doing anything offensively. They got a couple of long shots on net from the blue line, from the neutral zone, that never really had a great chance of actually going in. But they played a physical style of game. They started this game, surprisingly enough, for the San Jose Sharks, as in they took the opening face-off tonight. And so they kind of set the tone, so to speak. We saw Givani Smith get in a fight as well, which was perhaps a nice little wake-up call for the San Jose Sharks to be able to go on and win this game. So generally a positive game, I guess, for the fourth line, but not exactly amazing or outstanding. When it comes to the defensive side of things, there have been a bit of a musical chairs going on with the Sharks defensemen, because as we know, there is a bit of a log jam there, or honestly a massive log jam there. Players coming in and out of the lineup, so you'll notice that Jacob McDonald didn't end up playing this game at forward like he had been over these past couple. You'll also notice that Nikolai Knyzhov stepped out of the lineup, and in his stead was Ty Emberson coming right back in and finding himself on the top pairing, sort of, I guess, with Mario Ferraro. And for this top pairing, I thought offensively, I liked that both of these players were very willing to jump into the play. In particular, Emberson, who was originally advertised as the type of player who's also just going to be another defensive guy, and I thought would just be relatively forgettable and kind of fade into the background with the multiple other defensive guys for the San Jose Sharks. But it's nice to see him actually going very aggressive at times. And he also had a very nice breakout pass that led to the Duclair goal as well. So he's been adding that extra offensive element that I was pretty surprised to see. It's nothing major, and there isn't necessarily a huge skill set there, but the effort at the very least follows. On the defensive side of things, Emberson was slightly hit or miss. At times, it felt as though he got beat a lot in his own zone, but otherwise he was decent enough, I guess. And the same goes with Mario Ferraro, who also continued to show some offensive elements. He was jumping in the play a lot. He was like that third kind of forward on some of the rushes for the San Jose Sharks, but it feels as though it never really amounts to anything when it comes to Ferraro's stick. He just doesn't seem to have that skill set to be able to finish off any offensive plays. So while he is there, he is a body, he is able to take shots, it doesn't really get anywhere for San Jose. Then when it comes to the second pairing for the San Jose Sharks, I guess we could call that Vlasic and Burrows. Burrows and Vlasic have been a pairing for a decent bit over this short season thus far. And, Vlasic, I appreciated him jumping a lot in the play last game against Pittsburgh, kind of sacrificing a lot of defensive responsibility to be able to jump up in the play, which was, I guess, kind of nice to see. But it seems as though he sat back in this one, likely off of the recommendations of David Quinn to do exactly that. But the fact is that when Vlasic sits back and plays defense these days, it's not very good, and that continued to be the case. It continues to be the case in which Vlasic is the odd man out on an already kind of weak defensive unit for the San Jose Sharks. He's clearly the type of guy who really shouldn't be playing in the NHL at this point until he proves otherwise, and he has yet to really do so thus far this season. And so the fact that David Quinn had healthy scratched him a couple of games and then brought him back and he's now consistently playing for whatever reason, I don't exactly know why, but he just is not very good. And when it comes to the other defensemen on this pairing, like I've mentioned time and time again in the past, Burrows started this season well, but ever since getting paired with Vlasic, it's just been a slow decline in terms of general play for him. Then when it comes to the third defense pairing, we have Okhotiuk for the San Jose Sharks. Now, this is a name that I have not mentioned thus far this season, but that doesn't mean that this is his debut game for the San Jose Sharks. In fact, his debut game came a couple of games ago against the Vancouver Canucks, which explains why I haven't actually mentioned him, is because I didn't mention any players in that game. And then his second game this year was against Pittsburgh, and this is now his third appearance with the San Jose Sharks, and finally I get to talk about him. Now, in those first couple of games, like with the rest of the team, he was very awful, manages to maintain his lineup spot throughout. It feels as though maybe David Quinn really wanted to give him like an actual chance in a real, relatively competitive game to show what he could do, and I thought Okhotiuk was actually pretty solid. There wasn't anything amazing or super standout, but the fact that he got paired with Ruda and managed to make Ruda look like a serviceable defenseman here tonight, when basically that hasn't happened for the entirety of this season thus far, is quite impressive. So this third pairing looked quite good thus far throughout this game. So that might be something to look at a bit more moving forward if he manages to indeed hold down that lineup spot. If you're looking to try and get Knyzhov back into the lineup at some point, I would not take out Okhotiuk. Instead, I would be removing Vlasic 10 times over. And then finally, we have the goaltender tonight for the San Jose Sharks, the true hero of the game, of course, as the Flyers almost doubled up, if not they did double up in terms of shots against for the San Jose Sharks, and that is Mackenzie Blackwood. He's had his struggles over these past couple of games getting pulled because, the Sharks have just gotten absolutely shelled in those last couple, but it never really felt as though it was Blackwood's fault in general. He's had some really good games, some really strong outings for the San Jose Sharks, even if he's never really gotten the offensive support. And while he didn't exactly get a ton of offensive support here tonight, he did get 2 goals, which was finally enough to get that victory. He is the first winner for the San Jose Sharks goaltenders this season over Kaapo Kähkönen, and he is really beginning and really just continuing to solidify his spot as the true starter of this team thus far. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they will take on the Edmonton Oilers. Now, originally, you would think to be pretty scared of the Oilers, but they've been struggling a lot thus far this season. In fact, even though the Sharks had been winless through 11 games, they found themselves only 4 points back of the Oilers heading into tonight, and now only 2 points back of the Oilers. So it just goes to show how bad of a start it's been for Edmonton. However, they still have 2 very dangerous players, and as we know, the Sharks have been very bad in terms of goals against thus far this season, and so at any moment you could just have McDavid explode for like 7 points in a game. So the Sharks will have to be very, very careful, and we'll see if they can actually win a second game. Class dismissed.